What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
I gave my parents half of every paycheck I earned for an entire year, and I did it without hesitation because they convinced me it was the right thing to do. They sat me down at the kitchen table one night, voices low and heavy, and told me they were drowning. My mom spoke about bills piling up and how they were barely managing to keep the lights on, while my dad shook his head and muttered about how he just wasn't able to work the way he used to, his health keeping him from bringing in steady money. I felt this crushing guilt, like if I didn't step in, I was letting my family collapse, and so I agreed without thinking twice. Every week, as soon as my paycheck landed, I moved half of it straight into their account, and I adjusted my own life around what was left. It meant saying no to dinners with friends because I couldn't afford them. It meant watching my savings stay flat while everyone around me was moving forward, and it meant carrying this constant stress of not knowing if I'd be able to cover my own emergencies. But at the time, I told myself this was what loyalty looked like. I figured if I just kept going, maybe they'd finally look at me the way they looked at my brothers. My parents had always made me feel like the spare part in the family, the one who wasn't celebrated, the one who had to prove her value. My brothers could do no wrong, and yet when they failed, it was brushed off. I knew deep down that I'd never get that kind of grace, but maybe by giving, by sacrificing, I'd earn some level of respect. There were days when I sat at my desk at work, staring at my bank app, feeling this quiet bitterness settle in. But then I'd hear my mom's voice in my head about holding the family together, and I'd swallow it down. I thought if I just kept my mouth shut and kept giving, eventually something good would come back to me. I held on to the belief that this sacrifice would mean something, that they would remember it. I didn't even question it when my dad said he needed me to cover some extra expenses because things had gotten worse. I handed over more without a fight. I watched a year of my 20s go by while living like a broke college kid, even though I was working full-time. When friends asked me why I didn't treat myself more, why I wasn't saving for a future of my own, I made up excuses. I didn't want anyone to know just how much I was handing over because, in my mind, it sounded pathetic. Who in their right mind would do that? But I told myself it was temporary, that maybe once the year ended, things would change. And then one night, scrolling on my phone after work, I saw a picture that froze me in place. My parents were standing on the deck of a cruise ship, smiling wide, drinks in hand, posting about how they were finally taking their dream vacation. The caption said something about how they deserved this after such a hard year. My heart sank so fast I thought I was going to be sick. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned, trying to process it. A cruise. Not just a weekend trip. A full-on luxury vacation. Paid for, I realized, by the money I had been giving them. At first, I told myself maybe there was some mistake, maybe someone else had paid for it, maybe this wasn't what it looked like. But the photos kept coming, each one flashing across social media like a punch to the gut. Them laughing at the dinner table, them lounging by the pool, them dressing up for formal night. And in not a single picture, not one mention, was I there. It was like I didn't exist. I could feel my throat tightening as I scrolled, my hands shaking, because deep down I knew there was no mistake. They had used my money to live the kind of life I couldn't even imagine affording for myself. I remember sitting there with a phone in my hand, replaying the last year in my mind, all the sacrifices I made, all the nights I stayed home because I couldn't spend, all the times I told myself that being the good daughter would count for something. And here they were, on a boat somewhere in the Caribbean, living it up like none of that mattered. I didn't call them right away. I just sat with it, staring at those photos, feeling this mix of humiliation and rage boil inside me. It wasn't just that they went without me. It was the realization that they didn't even think to include me, not once, not even as a token gesture. I had given them everything I could, and the message I got back was that I wasn't worth bringing along. The next morning, I finally broke and picked up the phone. My mom sounded chipper, like she was glowing through the line, and when I asked why they hadn't told me about the cruise, her voice faltered for just a second before she passed the phone to my dad. He didn't stumble, though. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said it flat out, like he was talking about the weather. "We didn't want you there. You're not fun. You would have ruined it." I swear my heart physically dropped when he said that. Every bit of air left my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't even find words. I just sat there, listening to the background noise of waves and laughter, while my father cut me out of my own family's life, like I was dead weight. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry, not then. I just swallowed it and said one word back, all right. And that was the moment everything shifted, because what they didn't realize was that I wasn't going to stay quiet forever. When my dad said he did not want me there because I was not fun and would ruin it, something in me went strangely quiet, like a door clicked shut somewhere inside the part of me that still believed I could earn my way into their approval by being useful, generous, and endlessly forgiving, and the silence that followed was not a void, but a plan forming in the dark, slow, and steady, without the noise of pleading or tears. I said all right in a voice that even surprised me, because it sounded calm in a way that did not belong to the girl who sent half her pay every week and told herself it was love, and I hung up, and I sat with the sound of ship music fading on the line. And I opened my banking app as if this was any other evening, and I was just checking my balance the way I used to do when I needed to talk myself out of a small purchase. What stared back at me was a year of transfers stacked like tiles, each note I had typed for my own reassurance sitting there in tidy lines, words like mortgage and utilities and pharmacy and emergency, and right beside them a photo in my head of the two people who raised me clinking glasses on a floating hotel they bought with the money I had convinced myself was keeping a roof over their heads. I scrolled past month after month, and I remembered specific days, like the weekend I skipped a friend's birthday dinner and pretended I was sick, or the afternoon I put back a pair of shoes that would have replaced the ones I had worn until the soles were thin, because I needed to cover what my dad called a surprise expense, and I thought about how easy it was to convince me, because I have always been the one who fills the gap, the reliable one, the person who can be counted on to swallow her own needs and take the hit for the team, and I realized how many times I had been thanked with silence, or worse, with little digs about how my brothers were doing more important things. I kept scrolling, and with each transfer a bitter little bead of memory threaded onto a line, and the line became a necklace I had been wearing around my throat, and I decided I was done choking on it. I changed my direct deposit destination first, not with drama or a text or some big declaration, but with a quiet update in the company portal that sent my next paycheck to a brand new account that no one knew about. And then I went into the recurring transfers and I turned off every single one, and I deleted the payee templates I had made for speed, the ones I created when I thought efficiency meant love. I checked the autopays I had set up for their phone plan, and their streaming bundle, and the subscription my mom swore she needed for her budgeting software, and I removed my card, and I sent a quick, bland email to each provider confirming that I was no longer the responsible party for those charges, and I felt a small, mean flicker of satisfaction that tasted less like cruelty and more like oxygen. I opened the folder in my cloud drive where I keep copies of everything, because that is who I am, the person who names files with dates and keeps receipts in case someone tries to rewrite history later. In that folder sat the small stack of documents my dad asked me to sign a while back when he said the family business needed me listed on online banking as a backup because he was not good with passwords and my mom did not trust herself with numbers. And I remembered how he had looked relieved when I agreed, and how my mom had joked that I was the only adult in the room. I logged in and the system welcomed me with the kind of cheery greeting that belongs to people whose lives are uncomplicated. And I clicked through to the settings where there was a single toggle that required dual approval on outbound transfers above a very modest amount, and I slid that toggle to on, and I changed recovery emails to the one I control. And I set alerts to ping me whenever anything moved, and I sat there staring at the confirmation message with a level of composure that felt almost clinical. I did not call them to announce any of this, because I am done giving free emotional labor, and I am done narrating my boundaries to people who treat them like dares, and I am done making my pain easy for them to tidy up with a laugh and a shrug. Instead, I took one more step that was not flashy but would matter, which was to write myself a simple memo summarizing the year of payments with dates and amounts and their notes, because the truth is boring and powerful when it is organized. And I sent a copy to an email account I keep only for important records, and I stared at that message in my sent folder and felt, for the first time in months, something like control. I let the next 24 hours pass without reaching out, and I muted the family group chat when the cruise photos kept rolling in with captions about joy and freedom and how they had finally done something for themselves after such a tough stretch. And I did not reply to my brother's little thumbs-up reaction to a photo of our parents posing under a banner about bucket lists, and I did not take the bait when an aunt left a comment about how family deserves to celebrate together because I knew what was coming and I wanted it to arrive without any warning. When the bank alerts started landing in my inbox, crisp and polite, showing attempted transfers from the business account that now needed a second approval, and when the autopays I had disabled tried to pull and bounce back with tidy error messages, and when my dad sent me a casual text about moving some money when I had a minute, I finally smiled because the first ripple was already moving. By the time their ship touched the dock and they turned on their phones for real, the ripples would be waves, and I would be the one holding the shoreline steady. The morning after I turned off the tap that had been feeding their life, I went to work like nothing had happened, and I answered emails and sat through a meeting about a project timeline while a steadier voice in my head kept repeating that I was not going to beg for respect anymore because I had already paid for it in full. And when lunch came, I stayed at my desk and opened the folder where I keep my records, and I built a clean ledger of every transfer I had made across the year with dates written out and notes they had used to justify each withdrawal. And as I watched the totals add up, I decided that I would stop arguing with feelings and start speaking only in receipts. Because people can talk around feelings, but they shut up when the numbers sit between us like a table that cannot be moved. I called the bank using the direct line that came with my secondary administrator status, and I introduced myself the way my dad had told me to do the day he made me the backup, because he hated dealing with two-factor codes. And the rep found the authorization on file and confirmed the permissions in that cheerful customer service tone that made this feel routine rather than personal. And I asked them to enable the dual authorization threshold, not only for wires, but for any outbound transfer above the smallest amount available, because the business was entering an internal audit period, and I asked that any new device authentication require in-branch verification with identification for all signers. And I requested alerts to my email for attempts and declines, and I heard the keyboard clacking while the rep told me this was a smart move during a reconciliation window, and I thought, yes, we are reconciling a lot more than ledgers. I moved on to the payment processor because that platform was the artery the business pretended was a vein. And once support verified my admin token, I submitted a request to place payouts in a hold-to-balance status pending an update of tax information and beneficial owner confirmations, which is the kind of dry phrase that sounds harmless until someone who loves instant cash flow tries to withdraw and meets a polite message about a temporary review, and I updated the statement descriptor to route all disputes and inquiries to an email I control so that any creditor who wanted to complain would complain to me first. And then I looked at the vendor list and sent a single professional note to each of the recurring suppliers stating that the company had initiated a purchasing freeze while invoices were reconciled, and that no shipments would be accepted without written authorization from the secondary administrator, whose name and contact sat at the bottom of the message in crisp black letters. I checked the family phone plan account because I had carried that weight too, and I confirmed that my line was separated from theirs and that my card no longer paid for their upgrades, which meant the next time they tried to upgrade a device at a nice duty-free kiosk, they would see my name disappear like a magic trick. And then I returned to my ledger and wrote a simple memorandum that described the past year as a personal loan with no interest and no collateral, which is exactly how they had treated it. And I attached statements and screenshots and confirmations, and I drafted an email addressed to both of them that said, in plain words, that while they were entitled to joy, they were not entitled to me, and that I was converting those transfers from an unspoken obligation into a documented debt, and that I would be happy to discuss a repayment plan once we agreed on some simple boundaries that included basic respect and a promise to stop pretending that I owed them my adulthood. I did not send the email right away because the timing mattered, and because part of me wanted them to feel the moment when easy money turned into a locked door with a peephole. And I scheduled it for the late morning on the day their ship was due to dock so that it would arrive roughly when they reconnected to the world and reached for their accounts. And then I set a quiet calendar reminder for myself to breathe and not pick up on the first call. And I muted alerts from the family group so I would not be tempted to jump into the usual circus. And I told one trusted friend what I had done, and she laughed, that tired laugh women use when the obvious finally happens, and she said I sounded colder than she had ever heard me. And I said I was not cold, I was finished. The first alert hit my inbox that evening while I washed a plate and scrolled with the back of my knuckle. A decline notice for an outbound transfer that wanted more than the threshold would allow without another approval. And then a second alert about a payout placed on hold awaiting verification, and then a third about a paused auto shipment that could not be released without my confirmation. And I watched the pattern light up like runway markers guiding a plane to a landing I had planned without telling the pilot, and I understood that by the time they reached port they would meet a version of me who did not need to raise her voice to be heard. I finished my memo. I attached the ledger again just to make sure nothing could be argued away as a misunderstanding. I added a single line at the end that said I expected nothing other than honesty and repayment, and I pressed schedule. And I placed my phone face down on the table because I wanted to learn who they became when they could not spend their way out of a conversation, and I promised myself I would not answer until the third call, which felt like the kind of rule a sane person makes when she is done being the family's easy button. And then I waited for the ship to come in with a calm that did not feel like me at all, knowing exactly what would happen the moment their screens lit up and the world told them that the old arrangement was gone. When their ship finally rolled within range and the signal bars on their phones crawled back to life, the systems I had set in motion did exactly what they were designed to do. Because the onboard account that the cruise line tried to settle against the business card ran straight into the dual approval wall I had raised the night before and bounced with a tidy notice that no funds would move without a second signer. And at almost the same moment the payment processor placed the week's payouts into hold to balance pending beneficial owner verification, which meant there was no emergency cash sloshing around to cover the gap. And as the guest services desk politely asked my parents for a different card and then a different card again, my inbox started blinking with alerts that read like short, bloodless poems about limits and declines and verification steps, and I sat on my couch with the phone face down until the third call came in with my father's name on it and the knowledge that he was no longer calling to explain why I was not fun, but because the world he had built on my generosity had developed a sudden and very inconvenient leak. I answered on the third ring and said hello in a voice that did not tremble, and he launched into a speech about how there must be some kind of mistake at the bank, how the vendor holds were outrageous, how the cruise staff was being unreasonable about a simple post-trip settlement, and I let him talk himself breathless before I told him, as evenly as if I were reading a calendar reminder, that there was no mistake and that the changes were the natural result of the past year being recategorized from a daughter's unspoken duty into a documented loan, and that until we had a written agreement about repayment and basic respect, I would not be approving any outbound transfers above the small threshold I had left available for trivial necessities, and that the business payouts would remain in review until the ownership details were updated to reflect reality instead of habit. He said I was being dramatic and ungrateful and that families do not treat each other like hostile counterparties. And I replied that families also do not use their daughter's paycheck to buy a week of umbrella drinks and then tell her she would have ruined the view, and if he wanted me to be sentimental then he should have thought about that before he converted my love into cash flow. He tried to pull the old trick where he layered guilt over logistics, switching between how dare you and you do not understand how cash timing works, and I let the silence stretch until he asked what I wanted. And I told him clearly that I had already sent a memo to both of them with a ledger of every transfer, that the last email they received included a straightforward acknowledgement of debt with a schedule that started small and grew as the business stabilized, that it contained two boundaries I considered non-negotiable, which were that my name would not be used as a punchline in the family group and that any future request for money would come with actual documentation instead of a story about emergencies. and that upon signature I would authorize a limited bridge to clear whatever hotel-style balance the cruise line was holding so they could walk off the ship with their dignity and a receipt rather than a supervisor escort. He sputtered that he would not sign anything sent by his own daughter as if she were a creditor, and I said we had already tried the daughter version for a year and it resulted in me paying for a vacation I was told I would ruin by showing up. And now we were going to try the creditor version because numbers do not lie even when people do, and I promised him that when respect returned, signatures could go away. While he was still deciding whether to shout or beg, my messages started stacking with vendor replies to the purchasing freeze note, and one supplier forwarded a screenshot of my mother's cheerful cruise photo under a line about delayed payments. And I could hear the exact second my father saw the same thing because his voice snapped from righteous to worried, and he asked whether I had told anyone about the cruise, and I told him I had told no one and I did not have to, because the internet had already done that for him, and because the only thing I had shared was a ledger, which was boring and devastating at the same time. He shifted to a new tactic and said my mother was in tears at the desk, that she was embarrassed, that guest services had threatened to hold their passports until payment cleared, and I felt a flash of the old urge to fix it all right now. And then I remembered his voice saying I would have ruined the trip, and the urge cooled into something steadier, and I told him I would authorize a one-time settlement within the hour if he and my mother signed the acknowledgement I had sent and texted me a photo of the signed pages, and that if he preferred to wait, he was free to do that too. But I would not be bullied into saving them from a mess they had made with my money and their mouths. He asked what would happen if they refused, and I told him that nothing would happen except the truth continuing to be true, because the processor would finish its review with or without their cooperation. The bank would keep the dual approval thresholds where they were. Vendors would hold shipments until written authorization arrived from me. The family phone plan that I had subsidized would remain separated, so he could not push charges through my card, and the only thing that would change is how long they stood at a counter learning what it feels like when the person you dismissed decides her voice matters more than your convenience. He went quiet for the first time since I picked up, and when he spoke again his tone had lost that edge he used whenever he wanted me to flinch, and he asked me to resend the document because they were having trouble pulling email on the ship's Wi-Fi. And I said I would text a link, and I did, and then I told him he had until the end of the hour to sign if he wanted me to bridge the balance, and he said that was impossible, and I said it was generous, and I ended the call before he could wind up again. And I sat there watching the little typing bubbles appear and disappear on my screen while the alerts continued to arrive, and when the hours slid past with no signature, another call came in from an unknown number that resolved into the cruise line's accounting office, and I let it ring while I opened the dashboard with the final access control and hovered over the toggle that would remove mobile approvals from every device except mine, because if they were not ready to treat me like a partner, then they could learn what it meant to face me as the gatekeeper, and as I pressed the change through, my phone began to light up nonstop. By the time the ship eased into port and the announcements told everyone to check their balances and settle their accounts, my screen had become a steady stream of missed calls from my parents, from the cruise accounting office, from an unfamiliar number at the bank that only rings when a threshold is hit, and from my brother who suddenly remembered my existence the moment his own card was declined at a gas station on his way to pick them up. And I let everything roll to voicemail until the third round cycled through, because I wanted the noise to peak before I cut it in half with something simple, measured, and final. When I answered at last, my mother's voice carried that bright panic she uses when she wants me to fix things without acknowledging that I ever fixed anything in the past, and she told me this had gone far enough. That the guest services supervisor was threatening to hold their passports until the onboard balance cleared, that the whole situation was humiliating, and that we were family and should not be doing this to one another, and when she finally inhaled I told her, in the same even tone I had practiced while watching the alerts stack up, that I would authorize a one-time settlement immediately after they signed the acknowledgement I had already sent, and that the bridge would be executed with a single-use virtual card locked to the exact amount and set to die the second the charge posted, which meant there would be no mystery overages and no late night surprises, and that once payment cleared, they could walk off the ship with their dignity and a receipt. She handed the phone to my father the way she hands over a heavy box, and he tried one more time to frame all of this as an overreaction to a harmless vacation, telling me I had embarrassed them, telling me I had weaponized money, telling me I was making something personal into something transactional, and I let him talk until he ran out of steam, and then I told him the quiet truth that I had avoided for years, which was that I had been the transaction for as long as I could remember, and that the only difference now is that I had finally priced my time and my trust. I texted them the document link again, watched the typing bubbles appear and vanish, and then received 2 grainy photos of signed pages with both their names on the lines as if the pen had weighed 100 pounds. And I forwarded those pages to the processor and to the bank rep who had flagged my account for expedited review, and I authorized the one-time settlement with a hard ceiling that matched the exact outstanding. Onboard total, and I listened as my mother exhaled into the line with a relief that sounded almost like gratitude, though she swallowed it before the word could form. The moment the charge cleared and the ship released their passports, I completed the second part of the plan, which was not loud or cruel, but incredibly effective. Because I uploaded the signed acknowledgement to the payment processor as a supporting document for a temporary payout split that sent the first portion of all future business disbursements directly to a dedicated repayment account in my name until the principal I had advanced over the past year was satisfied, and I emailed the business accountant the same ledger I had sent my parents, along with a new policy that any vendor orders would require dual authorization with my signature visible on the purchase order, and that any emergency expenses had to include documentation within 24 hours or the bridge would be rescinded. And I set an automated monthly reminder for a brief video call with their accountant rather than another family argument, because I was finished acting like a receptionist for their feelings. When what we needed was a bookkeeper for the truth. When they finally reached the parking lot and my brother's text shifted from jokes to accusations to wounded confusion, I sent a single message to the family group that said I would no longer discuss money on the phone, that all communication about payments would live in email where we could read it twice before replying, that the year of transfers had been converted to a formal loan with a schedule that respected their cash flow and my boundaries, and that I would not tolerate any more little digs about being not fun when my idea of fun apparently included keeping their lights on. The replies came fast and furious until they realized I was not taking the bait, and then the thread went quiet in that specific way that tells you the room has understood the new rules and is deciding whether to comply or to test them. And I left the phone on the table and made myself breathe through the old reflex that said I should fix everyone's stress before anyone asks me to, and I let that reflex pass like a wave that no longer knocked me off my feet. The following week brought the first payout under the new structure, and the processor dutifully divided the disbursement and sent the repayment portion to my account with a note that made the whole thing feel wonderfully boring. And vendors responded to the purchasing freeze with short confirmations that they would ship when the approvals arrived in sequence, and the bank alerts, which had hummed like a hive during the cruise, settled into a quiet, predictable rhythm that I could check without bracing for a punch, and in that calm I finally felt the cost of the past year leave my shoulders. My parents tried a few small tests, a quick transfer request late at night, a call from a different number asking me to just push it through this once, a message from an aunt about how life is too short to be so rigid. And each time I replied with the same sentence about written approvals and repayment progress and respect, and the repetition did what I needed it to do, which was to turn my boundaries into ordinary procedures that did not require me to bleed every time I enforced them. I did not post a thing online about what happened, and I did not tell friends beyond the single trusted person who had heard my voice change, and I did not spend the first repayment on anything symbolic, because this was not a victory lap so much as a reset of gravity in a house that had floated too long on my willingness to be the floor. When my father finally called and said he had reviewed the schedule with the accountant and understood the math and asked if we could try a dinner to talk like human beings again, I told him I would meet him. And then I added that before we sat down he should decide whether he wanted to speak to his daughter or to his creditor, because I would gladly be one or the other, but never again both at the same time. And the silence that followed was long and complicated and strangely respectful, and when he agreed to the first option, I said fine and hung up, and I realized that the last move in this plan had not been the bridge payment or the split disbursement or the locked approvals, but the simple decision to stop making my love the cheapest thing in the room and to charge full price for my peace from now on, which is why, when I finally slept that night, I knew I had won without burning anything down. And that felt better than revenge ever could, even if the result looked, from the outside, like a master class in it.